You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NYSHAX.
Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm Caroline Weaver, and with me is my co-host, Lars Jensen. Hey, Lars.
Great to be here.
Great to have you. Where are you calling in from? I'm in New York right now, and it is snowing. I didn't pack for that. Normally I'm in Austin, but it's kind of pretty at least.
Well, I'm in a much warmer place. I'm located in the U.S. Virgin Islands today. Very fantastic place.
I'm a little jealous of that. Well, Lars, I think we should cue in our audience on what this episode is going to be like, because this is actually the second time we're recording. We recorded this episode late last week. Today, it's Thursday, February 6th, and we decided that between last week and this week, so much had changed that it felt like we really needed to update the content a little bit. So you'll see an intro here at the beginning. We're in different clothes. The podcast will continue. It'll look a little different, but we're going to check back in at the end and talk about what has changed, if anything. What's the impact? And we'll just go ahead and get started.
And say what you will about Trump, but one thing's for sure, his policies keep those in supply chain on their toes. So from tariffs to trade deals, there's never a dull moment. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. It has brought, let's call it, an element of sharp unpredictability into some of the global supply chains.
And everyone I talk to, they're always asking for more unpredictability. So it's really good that he's adding it into the mix. But as we know, many of President Trump's policies deviate wildly from those we saw from the last administration and stand to impact supply chain and just about every other industry out there. So this will be part of a two-part series, or maybe more, who knows, maybe we'll need several. But our aim today is to cover at a high level the key themes we expect to resurface based on Trump and his first term, combined with what we've already seen up to today, which is a couple weeks after the inauguration. So Lars, let's kick off with what we'll see more of from Trump in his first term. What impact do you think he'll have on supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, the most obvious one to first grab hold of is the whole impact of tariffs, because not only is that widely talked about now, it was actually one of the things he also did factually during his first term. During his first term, he did introduce tariffs, started part of the trade war with China. Given that that's several years ago now, we can also see what the consequences were. And the consequences, at least from a supply chain, a shipping perspective, was basically completely predictable. It happened more or less as everybody expected. When you slap major tariffs on China coming with goods into the US, what happened was not a major shift of manufacturing back to the US. What happened was a shift of manufacturing to some degree down to Southeast Asia. And from a shipping perspective, it doesn't really matter whether I have my ship called China or Southeast Asia, it's still a trans-Pacific service. And we also saw a shift of some of this with Chinese goods then going to Mexico. And then it becomes a shade of gray whether there's actually any real manufacturing ongoing in Mexico, or whether it's just a tiny upgrade to allow you to call it Mexican imports instead. And again, it still means the goods are shipped across the Trans-Pacific. There's more work to be done here for the logistics companies. We have more complicated supply chains. One of the consequences that we saw was within a couple of years of these tariffs, there were headlines in terms of nearshoring. Because what happened was that Mexico superseded China as the largest trading partner for the US. And erroneously, in my view, this was interpreted as nearshoring. But as I explained before, it's not really nearshoring. Still Chinese goods. It just goes via Mexico, so it becomes Mexican instead of Chinese. So the long and short of it is, yes, he did put on tariffs. It didn't really have any material impact on the overall shipping volume flows. And the only impact it had was it will have made some of the goods in the US slightly more expensive because it now needs to move a more circuitous route than what it otherwise would have done.
So this time around, do you think that the tariffs are going to incentivize manufacturers that are based in Asia or importers that are using manufacturing plants in Asia to rethink where they're manufacturing?
So to a material degree, absolutely not. Let's look at what is going on here in the second round. First of all, some US importers are definitely tempted to forward some of their imports to make sure they get goods imported into the US prior to any tariffs. This kind of front loading of cargo, I know of cases where this began happening already in August and September last year, with the importers saying, we think Trump might win, so in order to be ahead of the curve, let's move more cargo in. You can do that if your cargo is not time sensitive and you have room in your warehousing already. And the amount of importers doing this have only been increasing in recent months. The next thing here is no one knows what kind of tariffs. I mean, Trump has been saying all sorts of things about tariffs on Canada, on Mexico, on China, on Colombia, on Taiwan, on the EU. There's basically a new target named more or less every single day, which of course means nobody has the slightest clue who will actually be subjected to tariff, when, and at what level. And in this level of uncertainty, importers basically have a choice. Do you front load cargo? In that case, at least you're insulated if there are tariffs. Or do you just lean back and wait and see? And it seems they are somewhat split. And the lean back and wait and see, that's where we get to your question as well. Because obviously some of those, I mean, I've been speaking to some of them as well. They've been through the thought process. Should we move some of our manufacturing to the US in case Trump comes with tariffs? And I cannot guarantee I've been talking to a representative sample at all, so take this more as anecdotal than anything else. But the sense I'm getting here is there's a large leaning towards not moving manufacturing to the US. If you want to move manufacturing to the US, that is a large and very long-term investment. You need to set up manufacturing locations, and you are talking perhaps a decade or more of investment to make sure this actually pans out. And contrast that with, this is the thinking of some of these importers. Yes, I might be subjected to tariffs, but if these tariffs are highly detrimental, there's a good chance that they will only last 4 years. So should I move into the US, lock myself into a manufacturing setup for 10 plus years for a problem that might last only 4 years? And at least the ones I'm talking to seem to be leaning more towards they'll deal with the tariff problem if and when it arises and take that as a tactical and not as a long-term problem. That was a very long-winded answer to the question of, in terms of, will these Trump tariffs materially move manufacturing to the US? I'm not so sure that's going to be the case.
I think that was a really interesting answer, though, because if you're thinking about all of the factors that go into deciding, there's a lot of catching up that the US would have to do in order to get to a point where we can be competitive in manufacturing here. But there's a lot of limitations with,
There is. And there's also other elements. It's not just a matter of, you can say, the funds of, let's simplify it and say, build a factory, for example. It's also a matter of, do you have the labor force? And here again, it's not that the US has a huge untapped labor force. I mean, employment has been growing consistently for the last 4 years. And if you want manufacturing to a large degree to move into the US, you're going to need millions of people in the labor force that you don't have. And this is where things are interconnected. Again, this podcast is all about Trump and what he might do. You're in the process of also now expelling a lot of people from the labor force. I know the ones that are being expelled are not there legally, but that doesn't change the fact that there's a lot of also illegal aliens that are de facto part of the labor force. So moving manufacturing to the US in an environment where the labor force to some degree is shrinking is not an attractive proposition for anyone. So that was on the topic of, you can say, the short-term impact of the tariffs. Then the next step is also, what will the impact here be in the medium term? And again, this is where we have to speculate again, because we don't know what will de facto be implemented. It could be that the tariffs are few and far between, in which case it's not really going to matter much. Or it could be massive across the board tariffs. If it is massive across the board tariffs, what I'm scared of is the following scenario. That will raise consumer prices in the US. I mean, that's what import tariffs do. And a lot of the US consumers are already financially strained. So adding a lot of tariffs on could easily lead to the effect with a lot of US consumers suddenly reining in spending. It's time not to buy as much. This would be problematic, because if that is the effect, you would on one hand have consumers that start to reduce their spending. At the same time, you would have had importers that for months have been front-loading cargo to avoid the tariffs. So you're going to be stuck with extremely high retail inventories and consumers that are not buying the goods. If that then transpires, what will the US importers do? Well, they are completely rational beings, so they will stop ordering more goods until they sell what is on inventory. And this is something that impacts container shipping supply chains extremely hard when you have these ups and downs in the supply chain. So in that scenario, you could see a very sharp drop in containerized demand into the US. Subsequent to that, and then again, you're talking 6, 9, 12 months down the line, the US consumers would start spending again. When they do that, the inventories will be more or less depleted, and suddenly the importers will go out on a massive buying spree, and you're going to have a massive surge in demand. This is not the first time we would have seen it. I think a good parallel is what happened in 2001, 2002. In 2001, and no, it's not related to 9/11 at all, but first half of 2001, there was a recession in the US. It was a somewhat unusual recession. The consumers didn't really stop spending, but the inventories were too high, and the importers decided to reduce their inventories. This caused container demand to drop like a rock, and freight rates to also go into free fall. Whereas in 2002, when the inventories had been reduced, suddenly container demand on the Trans-Pacific grew, I believe it was 22% year on year, as inventories then had to be replenished. So a significant impact, if you do get tariffs in the US of a substantial magnitude, we can very easily trigger the same roller coaster ride that would cause first a massive crash in containerized demand as consumers rein in, and 9, 12 months later, an extreme boom in containerized demand as the economy then gets back up into gear.
Yeah, there's a bit of whiplash, but also a lot of compounding variables that just make it seemingly worse and worse. Do you think there is a route where rather than the American people paying the tariffs, there's what Trump coined the External Revenue Service, where other countries are paying for those tariffs? Like, is that even a possibility? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I do have thoughts on that, and the ones who have met me will also know I'm usually not all that diplomatic in my choice of word. So let me try to be as diplomatic as possible. Trump's claims that the External Revenue Service is something that other countries pay to the US. The nicest term I can come up with is that this is completely fact-free. It is not a thing. Let's be absolutely clear on that. Tariffs are going to be paid by the US consumers for all the imported goods. And the reality will be that other countries will, of course, react and also put tariffs on US goods, which will mean that the US exporters will find themselves less competitive across the world. That is going to be the net effect. So the claim that External Revenue Service is something foreign countries pay to the US is patently wrong. That is not a thing.
All right. Well, maybe we should talk a little bit about the Panama Canal. There's been a lot of noise around it recently. There was a hearing yesterday on it, US side. So could you tell me a little bit about where things are at right now with it and why there's so much commotion?
Yeah, I think the commotion is obvious. I mean, it comes together with Trump then in his inauguration basically stated that the US wants to expand its territory, which is an interesting statement in a world where there is no territory not owned by somebody already. And it was also very clear he has his eyes on Panama, on Canada, and on Greenland, the way it looks right now. And if we zoom in on Panama, the argumentation around Panama has also been quite fact-free, to put it bluntly. And the Senate hearing that was there was kind of interesting to follow. I mean, you got the outgoing chairman of the FMC, you had the incoming chairman of the FMC, you had the president of the World Shipping Council, and you got a law professor in there. A large part of the argumentation has been that China somehow controls the canal. And if you pay close attention to what was being said at that hearing, there was zero, like an absolutely zero evidence of that coming in. There were a lot of talk about Hutchinson Ports, which operates 2 container terminals in Panama. But we should all be very clear that operating 2 container terminals has nothing to do with operating the canal. There was somehow alluded that because you had a container terminal, it would be easy to block the canal. But I mean, let's be real. Anybody out there can go out and charter a big ship and deliberately sink it in the middle of the canal if they so choose. That has nothing to do with who operates canals. So what we're looking at here is Trump seems to have created a massive geopolitical problem here that it is hard to see an immediate resolution to. Even the law professor there, he was looking at the agreement between US and Panama. I mean, the agreement was made during the Carter administration in the late 70s for the final handover in 1999. And the agreement, he was basically asking that one as well, can the US go down and do something if they feel there's foreign interference? And the law professor basically stated, first of all, he stated clearly he has no knowledge of the current situation down there, but purely hypothetically, who decides whether or not there's a problem? With the current setup in the treaty, the US can unilaterally decide that. So if the US unilaterally decides we think there is a problem, then within the treaty, yes, they are allowed to go down and do something. However, what he was also very, very clear about, there's only allowance to go down and basically fix the problem. There is nothing in the treaty at all, even remotely, that opens the opportunity for the US retaking control over the canal. That is not on the table at all.
So if the US were to retake the canal, what happens to those terminals that are owned by Hutchinson?
I would say if the US retakes the canal, talking about the terminal will be the least of our problems. In a geopolitical context, if the US actually does that, it would conceptually be absolutely no different than Russia taking Crimea. It would be conceptually no different than China taking Taiwan. It would be exactly the same.
Okay. Well, I know it's still a developing topic, so it might be something that we revisit in coming episodes. I wanted to switch topics and talk about something that you brought to my attention while we were planning some of these episodes. So there's this Ships for America Act that you mentioned, and it's basically an effort to revitalize the maritime industry within the United States. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, it's a proposal that's been put forward by several people in Congress, and as you correctly put it, at least their intent is to revitalize U.S. shipping. We can make a long discussion as to whether the U.S. shipping was as glorious as they make it out to be in the past, but that's not really the discussion topic here. Definitely, they want to see a much stronger U.S. merchant fleet. And it appears to me that what their suggestion might potentially work if you're looking at tankers and bulkers. I think one of the things driving them is a concern that the U.S. Navy might not have access to enough support ships from, for example, tankers that are U.S. owned and flagged. I can kind of understand that concern. But when you then read into it and see what does this mean for container shipping, we run into a significant problem. One of the elements in the Ships for America is a demand that over time, more and more of U.S. imports and exports, no matter from where in the world, has to be shipped on U.S. flag ships. Right now, there are very, very few U.S. flag ships. That's a situation that's developed over decades simply because U.S. shipping was not competitive. But the proposal as it is gives a 5-year grace period. And after that, over a 10-year period, the amount of cargo that needs to be shipped on U.S. ships increases by 1 percentage point. So 15 years after coming up with this law, 10% of U.S. imports and exports must be moved on U.S. flag ships. And this is not in the aggregate. This is at an individual shipper level. This is where from container shipping, it would present a major problem to U.S. importers and exporters. Because that will mean if I am importing just my own goods, what happens if I'm importing from a location that is not serviced by U.S. flag ships? How will I meet the requirement I have to move 10% on a U.S. flag ship? How does this apply in a world where transshipment is the name of the game? So I will move on multiple different ships. There are huge conceptual problems in those ones.
The idea is that they're hoping that the vessels are available worldwide so that everyone can get to that 10%. But in reality, you're thinking that's probably not
It's probably not going to be the case. And you can say implicitly, even the Congress people that are proposing this, they must know that this is not a competitive proposal. Because one of the things that's specifically in there as well is they realize that this proposal to mandate the use of U.S. shipping will be onerous in terms of costs, especially for U.S. agricultural exporters. So part of the bill is a suggestion to give government subsidies to US exporters to compensate them for this extra cost.
Can you explain why it's extra cost for exporters?
Because these ships would have to be built on US shipyards. They would have to be US flagged. This is much, much more expensive than building ships on other shipyards and having them operated out of other countries. This is more, you can say, a subjective opinion than anything else, but it appears to me that whoever is fronting this bill is of the misguided belief that US shipping is somehow competitive on commercial terms. They are not. They have not been competitive for decades. This is exactly why we don't have a lot of US flag shipping, because it is too costly. It's not something other countries have done to the US. This situation has arisen because US importers and US exporters over decades have deselected US shipping when it was available because it was too expensive. And this bill doesn't really do anything to lower the cost. It just mandates it has to be used.
And at this point, there aren't any large American steamship lines. They're mostly European and Asian. Does the proposal talk at all about adding a company that's an American steamship line to be managing this, or it's purely about building the vessels? And
purely about building the vessels. They are not mentioning setting up specific U.S. companies, as far as I recall. What they do have, though, is part of the proposal. It's a little bit technical, but effectively they want to slap a tax on Chinese vessels calling U.S. ports, which again, from a container shipping perspective, is on one hand a cumbersome thing to do, because when you are booking your freight, suddenly you would need to also contemplate what kind of ship am I booking on, because the cost is now different depending on the flag of the ship. And
well,
in practical,
you get rolled.
Yeah, and in practical terms, it can easily be circumvented. I mean, the largest Chinese shipping company is obviously COSCO. They're part of Ocean Alliance. If this was hypothetically introduced tomorrow, if you were sitting in Ocean Alliance, you would probably just say, that's great. COSCO, you're operating the Asia-Europe ships. CMA, CGM, you're taking care of the Trans-Pacific ships. Problem solved.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely an interesting situation. Is there an argument to be made that maybe we just buy vessels, and do they then become U.S. flagships if you buy them from other countries and now you own them?
That is one of the parts of the proposal, that because they realize that you cannot build a lot of U.S. ships tomorrow, the shipyards are not there for it. That's part of the 5-year grace period. During that period, there is the ability to then have foreign flag vessels reflagged and become American vessels. But again, that would make those vessels more costly to operate under American flag rules. All of this, at the end of the day, boils down to money. And this is where you can say two different things collide. On one hand, do you want the economically most optimal supply chain? If that is the case, then this is why we have ended up with shipping the way it is. I mean, for decades, shipping has gone down towards the path of who can deliver this in the most economically optimal way. On the other hand, and this is one of the driving forces of the Ships for America, is a specific US view on US security. And of course, that's a completely different discussion. And I think that's also why during this bill there is the realization that this is going to come at a cost, which is why the proposal is there to provide government subsidies to agricultural exporters, because otherwise this would kill the US agricultural export. They wouldn't be able to pay for it.
So at this time, would you say there's not really an immediate need to worry about it, or something to just be aware of, know that it is conversation happening?
Well, I would say it's somewhere in between. There's not anything tangible that can be done right now. From the tariffs, again, the only tangible thing you can do is you might want to front load some cargo if you want to do it. But apart from that, no tangible action can be taken because we have no tangible actual proposals. We just have a lot of talk. Then for the longer term, especially something like Ships for America, no, there's not something tangible you can do in terms of action. But what you should do, at least that would be my view, it's easy for me to say, I'm not sitting in the US, but if I was sitting in the US, as either an importer or an exporter, I would take the effort of looking through exactly what does this mean for my business and my supply chain, and then find out, is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? And depending on whether I think it's good or bad, now is the time to then say, fine, I need to talk to my local congressman or my local senator or whatever and find out, should I find somebody to support it or should I find somebody to lobby against this? I mean, this is the time to then influence it.
Yeah, that's great advice. Politics definitely has to start at that local
Yes.
level. So now is the time to make a difference there. Well, Lars, we got into a lot of topics here. I feel like we only really scratched the surface in terms of the impact that Trump may have on shipping. But I will say we have a knack for choosing very uncontroversial, relaxing topics, don't we?
No, and you can say the good part about bringing Trump up in this one is we got plenty of time to bring him up again, because I would be highly surprised if it's not worthwhile to revisit these topics again over the coming months.
Okay, so we are back in our present day at least. Lars, can you tell us what has changed? What's the impact? What's the difference from just 1 week ago?
There's a myriad of differences and yet not a lot changed. The basic conclusion from the talk we had first was that there's a massive amount of uncertainty, especially in relation to tariffs. That uncertainty is still there. Uncertainty in the supply chain equals cost. What we do know, of course, is the level of tariff that was announced by the US against both Canada, Mexico, and China. We know the retaliatory tariffs now being announced by Canada and China against the US. We know that the tariff on Mexico and Canada have been postponed for 30 days. But, and there's a major but coming here, we could see how rapidly this unfolded, both with the speed with which the tariffs were announced and implemented, and the speed with which it was again withdrawn. That does not give great confidence in the predictability of tariff levels, countries being impacted by tariffs, and dates for when tariffs will either be implemented or withdrawn. So again, back to the same conclusion as in our overall talk, this simply adds to uncertainty, which adds to cost in the supply chain. And that's likely going to be the case for months ahead. The next one coming up, obviously, is EU, which is likely to see tariffs of some sorts being announced from the US, and the EU is going to be highly likely to announce retaliatory tariffs. That's one thing that has both changed and not changed since our first conversation. Then there is one major thing that have indeed changed since our first conversation. That is within the last 48 hours, with Trump's announcement of his proposal for a peace plan in Gaza, which basically means that all the Palestinians should be moved out and the America take over the area. This is extremely important from a shipping perspective, because this approach has the potential to derail the current peace process. The current ceasefire is the only reason the Houthis are not shooting at ships in the southern Red Sea. If they start shooting at ships again, then the Red Sea crisis and all the deviations around Africa will absolutely continue. And in my view, the risk of this has heightened dramatically over the last couple of days. That is even a best-case scenario. A worst-case scenario against seeing this from a shipping perspective would be that this plan is attempted to be implemented, and we see Americans trying to take over parts of Gaza. This will extremely likely result in a widening of the conflict in the Middle East, and we could be in a situation where ships are being attacked not just in the southern Red Sea, but actually in the Suez Canal itself. So, as you mentioned, there's a million things that have happened since our first podcast, but I think these are the important highlights that we want to tack onto this. Uncertainty, absolutely the name of the day, and uncertainty have not gone down.
And if you haven't listened to our episode on the Red Sea opening up and what that might mean for capacity and the freight market moving forward, check it out. That content is pretty fresh. We recorded it just a couple weeks ago. So if you wanted to learn more about the situation, go listen to that podcast. But I wanted to quickly circle back to the tariff and delays with its implementation. I think something that people might not recognize is that importers are still taking action. They still have to plan to alleviate some of the pain that they might feel if they don't otherwise act. So, you have importers that are moving things along more quickly, importing, trying to get them in before the tariffs. And I think that's going to cause a surplus in inventory in certain areas. And that's probably going to impact, the trucking and warehousing networks within the United States.
And you could have the added effect of importers in the face of this massive amount of uncertainty, moving cargo in earlier than planned. And in some cases, they might incur added costs simply by doing this action. And this added cost, of course, at the end of the day, will also translate itself into higher cost retail end of the chain.
Yeah. It's all a gamble, it seems. There doesn't seem to be one right answer. It's definitely an individual strategy depending on your company. But thanks, Lars, for all of this insight. We wanted to let the audience know that our next episode that we will be recording will be open for audience members to join. So if you're interested in joining and hearing this all live, you'll hear it, about a week before it airs. Feel free to go to nychex.com/podcast to register. It's a free registration, and you can join in, ask questions in the chat. You can ask questions to us. You might even be lucky enough to get on air. So we look forward to seeing some faces, and we look forward to your questions. So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by NiceShacks. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.